And as much as I admire Eduardo Garcia, and as much as I admire what he stands for in this video, this morning is actually not going to be an advertisement for Saucony's Run for Good campaign. What we are going to do this morning is we're going to use that line from Eduardo Garcia, and we're going to use it as sort of a launching pad for our discussion about the gifts and the abilities that God has given each and every one of us spiritually. So this morning we're talking about spiritual abilities, spiritual gifts, but like Molly said a moment ago, you cannot miss next Sunday here at New Life. January 5th is a Sunday that you cannot afford to miss if you consider New Life Church to be your home. Why? Because Pastor Ryan Godin, he's sharing the vision that we believe God has for our church, and during that service, what we're going to do is we are going to set the stage, we're going to set the tone for the entire rest of 2020. I know you've got to insert the corny 2020 dad joke, the 2020 vision dad joke, but it is what it is. This week, we're talking about those spiritual gifts, spiritual abilities, and that line, that an ability that is not used is a disrespect to our abilities. I believe that line, it echoes the words of Paul from the New Testament. When Paul is writing what is a large portion of the New Testament, he writes one letter to a very specific church in the ancient city of Corinth. And he writes them this letter because they had some questions about spiritual gifts and how they should be practiced. They had some questions about the purpose behind these spiritual gifts. So let's listen to what the Apostle Paul has to say to the church in Corinth here in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 4 through 11. Paul says there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but the same God works all of them in all men. Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. To one there is given through the Spirit the message of wisdom. To another the message of knowledge by means of the same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit. To another gifts of healing by that one Spirit. To another miraculous powers, to another prophecy, to another distinguishing between spirits, to another speaking in different kinds of tongues, and to still another the interpretation of tongues. All these are the work of one and the same Spirit, and He gives them to each one just as He determines. Father, we thank You for this, Your word to us this morning. And God, I pray that as we approach Your word, that we would do so with humble hearts and with open minds, and that we would be able to dig deep within it and to extract meaningful truth from it. So God, that truth might be applied to our lives and that we would walk out of this room different than we walked in. Father, help me as I begin to speak. Lord, to communicate clearly, to speak Your truth with boldness. And Lord, humble me and help me to remove myself from this equation as much as possible so that it is only Your word that goes forth. Jesus, we pray all these things in Your name, and everyone said, amen and amen. So from the passage which we have just read, we're going to see the big idea this morning that we glorify the giver when we utilize his gifts. We glorify the giver when we utilize his gifts. Now, I love that Eduardo Garcia guy. I think he's great. But I don't think that his line there, that quote that we're using this morning, I don't think that his words go quite far enough. Because he simply says that when we don't use an ability, it's a disrespect to that ability. I would agree. But the Apostle Paul, he takes things one step further. He says that when we don't use the spiritual abilities that God has given us, when we don't use the spiritual gifts which we have been granted, what we're really doing is we're dishonoring the God who gave them to us. We're dishonoring the God who has given us those abilities. So that's why this morning our big idea is that we glorify the giver when we utilize his gifts. And in that big idea, we just use some really churchy lingo, right? Like glorifying God. What does that look like? What does that mean in real life, 2019? What does glorifying God look like? And very often, I don't think that we pause and we consider what things like that mean. We just kind of take them for granted. So before we dive too much deeper into what Paul has to say, I just want to pause for a moment at the beginning of this message and think together, what does it mean to glorify God? I'd suggest maybe we could think about it like this. Let's say it's the morning after Christmas. You've got all your gifts open and you lay them all out in front of you, looking at all the cool things your parents got you, and you call up your buddies. Don't pretend like you haven't done this. I know everyone has. Call up your buddies You get ready to lay it on them because you got way cooler gifts than they did. You're ready to brag about all the cool things that your parents got for you and how great your Christmas was. In that moment, what you're really doing is you're not just bragging about the gifts you got, but you're bragging a little bit about how great your parents are. Because let's be honest, like, you didn't get any of those gifts for yourself when you were a kid. That was your parents. They're trying to bless you. They're trying to show you that they love you and they care about you and they want you to have good gifts. So those gifts that we've been given, what they really do is they sort of reveal the character of the giver. Our gifts reveal the character of the giver. And I believe that we could say the same thing is true when it comes to our spiritual gifts. That our gifts reveal the character of the giver, that when we utilize our spiritual gifts in order to glorify the God who gave them to us, really what we're doing is we're showing the world what God is like. We're showing the world that, man, we've got a good God who wants to give us good gifts, who wants to work these gifts together for the common good. So as we proceed and talk about how we glorify God through these gifts, think about it in that context, in the context that we can glorify God by utilizing these gifts because we show the world what our God is like. And I think that this Sunday, in between Christmas and in between New Year's, it's kind of a fitting Sunday to talk about gifts because we're past Christmas, right? Everybody's got all their gifts open. Everybody's playing with them. Yes, I said playing with their gifts. I'm an adult, I promise. And we've gotten all these gifts. We're using them. Or maybe you're the kind of people, the horrible kind of people, who you don't use all your gifts. Like, you've already got your re-gift pile, you've got your return pile, and you've got your pile that you know are just going to go into storage. Maybe you're that kind of person. Or maybe you're the kind of person who you've decided that these gifts that you've gotten, well, they're not a horrible person, but these gifts, they're just horrible gifts. You can't use them. There's no way you can use them. Somebody got you a horrible gift this year. Maybe they just didn't know you, or they thought you would like something that you didn't. Maybe that's the case. But regardless of what kind of gifts you got this Christmas, my wife and I, we've had what I would call the most adult Christmas that we've had yet. And now I don't mean adult in the sense that you might be thinking. What I mean by having an adult Christmas is that we got each other incredibly practical gifts. We got each other gifts that some people would consider downright boring. So we got each other gifts because we're remodeling a 100-year-old house. If you've been following my wife on Instagram at all, you've seen all of these posts about how we're fixing up this house room by room by room. So we decided we're going to invest our Christmas into some of these projects around the house. Not a bad idea. So this year for Christmas, I got to build a barn door. Chelsea got a new bedspread. I got to install new crown molding, and Chelsea got some new curtains. It's a great Christmas, but it's a great Christmas because we put those gifts to good use. And it might not seem like that big of a deal for like us to use these gifts that we got for each other. But in our relationship, my wife and I, we have this horrible habit of being bad gift receivers. Now, I'd say we get each other pretty good gifts. I'd say they're pretty good. But let me paint a picture of what I mean. So one year, I think it was my birthday, maybe it was Christmas, my wife, she gave me this backpack. And this backpack, it was a cool backpack, don't get me wrong. It was like a hipster backpack with like the canvas, like the flap and like the leather straps and the buckles. It's a cool backpack, but I'm kind of a backpack snob. And she got me this backpack, and I opened it up, and I looked at it, and then I looked at my wife, and I said, Chels, you might as well just return it because I'm never going to use that gift. Like, I am a horrible receiver of gifts. I'm horrible at putting these gifts into practice when I receive them, putting them to good use when I receive them. And I think that most of us can probably relate on one end or the other because most of us, we've been on one end or the other of a gift gone wrong. Like, we've given someone a gift and we've watched them never use it. Or we've gotten a gift and we've been the one who doesn't use that gift. Like, when I was a kid, man, I was horrible at this. My parents, they'd get me something that was a little bit too expensive. Like, I had definitely not been that good that year. They'd give me something a little bit too expensive, a little bit too nice for me, and I would open it, and I'd feel kind of guilty. Like, I don't deserve this gift. And then that guilt would, like, motivate me to play with it for a week or two. And that gift would end up in the pile of all the other gifts in the basement from Christmases past, collecting dust. Just like all those other gifts, I would fail to use it. So just wanted to issue a public apology to Mom and Dad in case you guys are watching, or maybe if you watch later. I wanted to say I'm sorry for the He-Man Castle Grayskull, the punching bag, the Hero Clicks board game, and the laser tag set, and any other gifts that I'm not thinking of that I did not put to good use. Like I said, I was terrible at using the things that people got for me. As a kid, I know for a fact that I wasn't often considering the perspective of the person who gave me that gift. Wasn't considering how the giver might feel when I failed to use whatever they got me. But this morning, as we approach Paul's words to the church at Corinth, that's actually exactly what we're going to do. We're going to consider God's perspective. We're going to consider the giver's perspective and how he might feel when we don't put these gifts that he's given us to good use. How does God feel when he has given us everything that we need for participation in the life of the church? And instead, we would rather sit on the sidelines rather than serve, rather than use those gifts. What does God feel? Does it hurt God's heart? Maybe does it frustrate him, or does it annoy him when he's given us everything that we need but will fail to use those gifts time and time again? But when we remind ourselves of the perspective of the giver, I believe what will happen is we'll be reminded as well of the purpose of these gifts, that we will remember that these gifts are to be used in order to glorify the giver. So then if that is the case, we have a couple of questions that we have to answer. If these gifts glorify the giver, then we need to know how we put these gifts into practice. How do we use these spiritual gifts in practical ways? I also think that we need to figure out why these gifts are so important. Why does Paul take so much space in this letter to explain these spiritual gifts? Why are these gifts so necessary for us as believers? I believe Paul's words to the church in Corinth provide us with a couple of insightful answers to these questions. We'll start back at verses 4 through 6. And here in verses 4 through 6, I believe Paul, what he does is he gives us the first step to putting these gifts into practice, the first step to utilizing these gifts to glorify the giver. And that first step is that we focus on the giver, not on the gift. Verses 4 through 6, Paul is making the point that we must focus on the giver and not on the gift. Verse 4, Paul says there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but the same God works all of them in all men. Here at the very beginning of our passage, what does Paul do? He hammers home this point, that the gifts don't come from the Corinthians. They don't come from anyone else around them. They only come from God himself. In the Corinthian church, they really didn't have a problem with practicing spiritual gifts. They're actually pretty good at it. They were almost too good at it. They were actually a church that was probably pretty well known as being hyper-spiritual, sort of overusing these gifts, sort of forgetting where they had come from. They had lost their focus on the giver and instead had focused on the gift. Like I said, when I was a kid, it wasn't very often that I considered the giver's perspective, but I do remember the first time where I ever thought about how the giver of a gift might feel when I had failed to use it, or when I had maybe not used it the right way, or when I ruined a certain gift. And my parents, they like to do this thing on Christmas where they would surprise me with like one big gift every year. One big gift. It was like a big surprise. And we had this deal in my house where from December 1st to December 25th, I was not allowed to enter my parents' bedroom because that's where the presents were secretly stashed. I was not allowed to go into my parents' bedroom, and lo and behold, one morning, I had forgotten that we had already reached the month of December. So I walked into my parents' bedroom, and if you don't know me, I really enjoy books. I think books are great. Like readers are leaders. I'm bought into all of that stuff. And even though all my books in my office aren't unpacked yet, it's only been a year and a half. Give me a break, guys. We're getting there. Even though my books in my office aren't unpacked yet, I love books. My parents knew this. They wanted to surprise me with something where I could store all of my books. So I walk into my parents' room. Lo and behold, I lay eyes upon a bookshelf. And this is like the most beautiful bookshelf I have ever seen. It's like 7 feet tall, like solid red oak. And instantly, my eyes, they well up with tears. Partially because I'm beholding a beautiful specimen of woodworking skill, designed for storing tomes of knowledge. But also because in that moment, I realized I had ruined their surprise. This was the big surprise. This was the big gift that my parents had wanted to give me this Christmas, and I had ruined that surprise. All I could think in that moment was of how my parents would feel, was of the perspective of the giver. All I could think in that moment is, what are my parents going to think because I have ruined this surprise? It was the first time that I ever really considered the giver's perspective. And I believe that sometimes in our spiritual lives, we find the same thing is true. It's very easy for us to get caught up in our giftings. It's very easy for us to get caught up with what we are good at. And sort of as an aside, there might be some of us who we're not really caught up with what we're good at, but rather we're thinking we're not good at anything. Maybe you're thinking, I'm not talented in any sort of way. Well, if you're thinking that, then in all reality, you're wrong. Because what God's word says in Matthew chapter 7, verse 11, is that God only gives us good gifts. We read this verse just a few days ago. God only gives us good gifts. We only get good things from Him, and we have no excuse to not put them into practice. But if you're like most people, you probably know what you're good at and what you're not so good at. But just because you know what you're good at doesn't mean that you always remember why you are good at those things. Just because you know where your gifts are doesn't mean that you know the purpose behind those gifts. But when we remind ourselves of the perspective of the giver, when we remind ourselves who these gifts have come from, what happens is we also remember the purpose of these gifts. We also remember we're called to utilize these gifts in order to glorify the giver. And the first step in making that happen is focusing on the giver instead of on the gift. So these first few verses, Paul says, focus on the giver, not on the gift. And then in verse 7, Paul moves to another idea. The point here in verse 7 is that our gifts are greater together. Verse 7, our gifts are greater together. Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. To each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. God's Spirit is working in all of us together for the common good. And if we've been paying attention to the words that Paul is using here, everything he is saying is sort of directing the Corinthian church to understand that they are united. That they are all under this umbrella of God and His blessing and His giftings. That they are all brought together and united by God's gifts. And the words that he uses, he says the same Spirit, the same God. All of these gifts working all together for the common good. He uses these terms to show the church in Corinth that our gifts truly are greater together. And I believe that when we take our gifts and we put them together and we direct them at a common goal, man, that's a beautiful thing. That is a beautiful thing when our gifts are put together toward a common goal. And I believe that we see this principle in practice nowhere better than in the cul-de-sac snow pile from when I was in middle school. Now let me explain, because I know we are in Missouri, and I know that there's not a lot of snow that we receive in Missouri. But in Michigan, when I was growing up, they would take the snow from all the streets in our neighborhood, and they would shovel it into our cul-de-sac. And my buddies and I, when we were in middle school, like all we could see in that snow pile was snow fort potential. All we could see was snow fort potential. We looked at it and we said, man, we could make that into a beautiful snow fort. And so me and my buddies, we each had a different set of gifts when it came to building snow forts. Three of my buddies, Tony, Michael, and Jake. My buddy Jake, he was a farmer, grew up on a farm. He had that backwoods, like farmer strength. It's a real thing. You could ask him about it. He's stronger than anybody else I know. And he was literally built to move massive piles of snow. And then my buddy Tony, he was tall, he was kind of skinny, and he could make the ceiling, like the top layer of our snow fort, he could make it impenetrable to enemy snowballs, okay? My buddy Michael, he was a little different. He was small, like kind of skinny, and he could get in and out of like tunnels that we built into the interior of our fort. Then there was me. And I wasn't very strong. I definitely wasn't very tall. I'm still not very tall. And I wasn't very skinny either. I was kind of a chunker when I was little. I was in middle school. I was a chunky little dude. So I wasn't very good at building snow forts. But man, I tell you one thing. I had some good ideas. When it came to building a snow fort, I had an idea that maybe we should work smarter instead of working harder. Instead of using all this manpower to excavate the snow, we should use technology in our favor. And I came up with this genius plan where we would build the first ever snow fort torch. So what I did was I took an old broken broomstick, I wrapped it up in old t-shirts and rags. I soaked that sucker in gasoline, we lit her up, and we went to town melting away the snow inside of our fort to make it beautiful. I think we've got a picture of the most beautiful, most perfect snow fort that I've ever built. Check that sucker out. Look at that bad boy. Yeah. I'm just kidding. I didn't build that. I found that on the internet. Here's a picture of the snow fort we actually built. That is, it's really, in all honesty, it was more just like a 6-foot pile of snow. And with maybe if we were lucky, a tunnel that went through it. But it really was a beautiful thing when we all put these gifts together at a common goal, toward a common goal. It was so beautiful because each and every one of us, we had a different gift. But just because our gifts were different, It didn't mean that our gifts had different levels of value. Each person had a part to play. Each of us had an important and invaluable role in building that snow fort. And like I said, it's beautiful when our gifts come together toward a common goal, but it is even more beautiful when that goal just so happens to be God's glory. It is even more beautiful when all of our gifts are utilized toward the common goal of bringing God the glory. And I thought to myself, what does that look like here at New Life Church? Well, I think we do an incredible job of putting our gifts together in ways that bring God glory, in ways that reveal God to the world around us. I think we do a great job of that here. Then I thought to myself, well, what would it look like at New Life if we didn't do that? What would it look like at New Life if certain people decided, we're just not going to use our spiritual gifts to serve the church in any way? Well, for one thing, some of the people who serve behind the scenes in the cafe, to create an environment that welcomes guests, to create an environment that says, hey, we're ready for you and we want you here. If they decided they weren't going to serve, there'd be far less families who return to New Life. Or maybe if some of the people who serve behind the scenes on the lawn team, who come up during the week and make sure that the lawn is trimmed and that the landscape looks fresh, if they decided they weren't going to serve, I don't know about you guys, but I wouldn't want to crawl through a jungle in order to enter the church. And I can just about guarantee that our services would be shorter if the auditorium had to function as a nursery as well. Because, let's be honest, we don't want crying babies in the auditorium. And if all the baby wranglers in the nursery decided they weren't going to use their spiritual gifts, that would make for a really, really short service. It's a beautiful thing. You put all these gifts together towards God's glory. I also believe that it's a beautiful thing because in this verse, Paul explains that God's glory and our good, they're not two concepts that are somehow at odds with each other, somehow divorced from one another, but in fact, they're two concepts that are two sides of the same coin. What glorifies God also just so happens to be what is the very best for us. God's glory and our good are seen together. And no matter how we look at verse 7, what we see is that these gifts truly are greater together. They are greater for our good, and they are greater for God's glory. So finally, in verses 8 through 12, as Paul closes this section, and he's making the point that we need to get good at using our gifts. We need to get good at utilizing our gifts. Verse 8, to one there is given through the Spirit the message of wisdom. To another, the message of knowledge by the same Spirit. To another, faith by the same Spirit. To another, gifts of healing by that one Spirit. To another, miraculous powers. To another, prophecy. To another, distinguishing between spirits. To another, speaking in different kinds of tongues. And to still another, the interpretation of tongues. All these are the work of one and the same Spirit, and He gives them to each one just as He determines. This last section of this passage, what Paul does is he encourages the church at Corinth to get good at utilizing their gifts. He's basically saying, hey, you just need to put these gifts into practice. Whatever gift you've been given, you need to use it. You need to put that gift to good use so that you are glorifying God through it. And in these verses, what Paul is doing is as he writes to the church in Corinth about how these gifts are supposed to be practiced, he writes about the purpose behind these spiritual gifts and how we're supposed to use them within the church. He's sort of eliminating every excuse that they have. He's eliminating every excuse. I can almost hear him anticipating what they might say. Well, I'm not good enough for that gift. Well, Paul reminds them that these gifts don't depend on your goodness, they depend on God's goodness. Well, why does he have that gift and I have this gift? Paul reminds the church in Corinth that these gifts are given to different people. God gives different gifts to different kinds of people. And you might be thinking, well, that list of gifts, that sounds like really spiritual. And it does. That's 100% true. It sounds like prophecy, words of wisdom. We don't hear a lot of sermons about that kind of stuff. But we can't miss what Paul is doing here, because just a little bit further down in this letter, in verses 28 through 30, Paul does is he has another list of spiritual gifts. But these seem a little more practical, like hospitality, administration, gifts like these. And what Paul's doing is he's showing the Corinthians that the spiritual gifts and the practical spiritual gifts, that they're both on the table, that they are both available. Because imagine this, that God is willing and waiting to heal someone through your prayers. But you've decided that prayer, that's more of like a New Testament thing. That's not really for today. Miracles aren't on the table for today. Imagine the disservice that does to the church. Imagine the disservice that does to the person that God is willing and waiting to heal through your prayers. That's like going to the Cheesecake Factory and having your waiter tell you that you can only order 3 of their entrees when they have a 6,000 entree menu. That's a horrible experience. No one wants to be limited in that way. And what Paul says is that when it comes to our spiritual gifts, we're not limited in that way. That they're all on the table. Whether it's practical, whether it's spiritual, these gifts are available to us. These gifts are available to us, but it is up to us to put them into practice and to use them. And here at New Life, one of my favorite parts of my job is when I get to see our students who use their gifts to serve the church. Work with our students on a weekly basis, and I get to see our students serve the church through their gifts. It's amazing. Just the other day, I was at Kickapoo High School, eating lunch with some of our students here, and I got to have a conversation with one student. His name's Hunter Jones, and he was telling me about how much he loves his photojournalism class. Never even heard of photojournalism. Loves his photojournalism class because he loves telling stories through photography. I said to Hunter, dude, I love that you're passionate about a class in school. That's like an anomaly for a teenager. I said, Hunter, I bet that passion that you have for that class, I bet we could use that on a Sunday morning because I can almost guarantee they would take another person on the photo team. Because what we do at New Life, Hunter, is we take pictures of what God is doing here, and it tells the story on social media or maybe through just people's photography or people's photos on Facebook of what God is doing here at New Life Church. And then the next week, Hunter got signed up for the team. The week after that, Hunter started taking photos on Sunday morning. And what Hunter is doing is he's helping people know Jesus better because he's telling the story of what God is doing here at New Life. He's getting good at utilizing the gifts which God has given him. He's putting them into practice. He's using them to bring glory to God. So at New Life, what does it look like to practice our spiritual gifts? Well, if you were going to practice your spiritual gifts, how would you do so? Well, at New Life, we've made it incredibly easy for you to do so. We have a system called Growth Track. And Growth Track, what we've done with it is we've tried to be a little bit like the Apostle Paul. We have tried to eliminate every excuse. Growth Track, it's the best kind of class. You only have to go to it once. And it's an hour long, a little more than an hour. But at Growth Track, we eliminate every excuse. We provide free lunch. We provide free childcare. And guess what? If you miss one Growth Track 1 month, we have it every single month. Just like the Apostle Paul, we eliminate every excuse so that we can encourage every person to get plugged in and to serve, to utilize their gifts for God's glory. And my favorite part of those Growth Track classes is when we bring the class to a conclusion. We have a stack of names. We have a stack of people who are signed up to serve the church, who are signed up to serve because they know that the best way to get good at utilizing their gifts is to serve right here at New Life. So this morning, as we come full circle and sort of round out this discussion of our spiritual gifts, I'd like to return back to the words of Mr. Eduardo Garcia for a moment. An ability that is not used is a disrespect to our abilities. I believe we've seen that those words are true, but even more so, that it doesn't just disrespect our abilities, but it disrespects the God who gave us those abilities when we fail to use them. And maybe as we've heard what Paul has to say about spiritual gifts, maybe you've sat through this service and you've been thinking to yourself, man, everything that God gave me this year, I failed to put it to good use. Maybe as we've sat through this service together, what we're thinking is, we have utterly wasted what God has given us this year. Maybe we're facing some feelings of disconnectedness, feeling as if we're not engaged, or we're not involved, or maybe we're facing feelings of not making a difference or not having a purpose. If I could, I would suggest maybe a possible reason why we'd be facing some of those feelings. I believe it's entirely possible we would be facing those feelings because we may have failed to put those gifts into practice. We may have failed to glorify the giver through those gifts. And as you look back over 2019, maybe what you see is a less than perfect picture of what it looks like when someone uses the gifts they've been given to bring God the glory. It's totally possible. And if that's you, if that's how you're feeling, you're probably not alone, because I don't think there's a person in this room who would say that they have perfectly used every gift God has given them. But there's more good news, because when we look to the New Testament, when we look to the story of Jesus, what we find is we find a story of one who did utilize their gifts perfectly towards God's glory. One who used everything that God gave him. Jesus used everything at his disposal, and when he did, he changed the course of history for eternity. When he did, he enabled you and I to receive these same spiritual gifts from the Spirit. So this morning, how are we going to finish this service? How are we going to finish 2019? We're going to finish the service in this year by glorifying God with what He has given to us. Because in a moment, you're going to have an opportunity to set the stage for 2020. You're going to have an opportunity to finish this past year strong, no matter how it looked before today. In a moment, you're going to have an opportunity to worship with us, to literally bring God glory with what you have been given. And what have we been given right here, right now, in this moment? What do we have with which we can glorify God? For one thing, we have our voice, with which we can bring Him praise. We have our hands, which we can lift high toward heaven in honor of our Father. And we have our very lives, which we can give over unto Him for His glory. I fully believe that as we glorify God with everything that He has given us in this moment, as we glorify the giver by utilizing the gift in this moment, that we will make the most of the moments to come, that will glorify God in those moments as well. Let's pray together.
Thank you for watching our services. If you have questions or you would like more information, you can visit us online at nlspringfield.com. We'd also love to have you join us at one of our Sunday morning services. We have programs at 9:30 and 11 for adults, students, and kids. We hope to see you there.